This is the story of a free boat. And like Santa Claus and unicorns, free boats generally don't exist. This fellow advertised a Sparkman Stephens Blue Jay that he had sitting in his backyard for free. And upon going to see it, for some crazy reason, I decided it might be salvageable. I gave him $1 to make it official. And I hauled it to my friend Buddy's house because he had an unused garage space we could store it in. We started to look it over. It had lots of flaking, varnish, a bit of delamination on the plywood panels. But it did have some nice pieces of brass hardware and a lot of mahogany interior pieces. So we thought it had hope. We actually found the original measurement certificate on it and found out the boat had been built in 1961. It also had a great big hole which had rotted out in the bow. The water had pooled there, and that might have saved the hull, since once the hole formed, the water drained out after that. It did have a good set of sails, so we were happy about that. It even had a spinnaker. In any case, the first step of our project was more or less demolition. We started stripping off all the hardware, pulled off all the various bits and pieces we could. I think I was roaming around in what we called spider country there in the foredeck. Also discovered that whatever had been used to attach the original fiberglass, some kind of polyester epoxy, more or less had never bonded to the plywood, so we could peel it off in sheets. Unfortunately, the rest of the paint was extremely well bonded and took an enormous amount of sanding to remove. We were basically covered in red dust for days on end. But little by little, the old paint came off and the extent of our project became more and more clear. We did also get a home-built trailer in the deal, but that would be a later project. In any case, we stripped out the floorboards, which I think were cedar, and little by little continued to sand until we more or less had a bare hull. Also dremeled all the rotten wood out of the damaged bow and tried to decide how to repair that. Now keep in mind that at the time, neither Buddy nor I had ever taken on a project like this before. So we really didn't have a clear idea what we were doing most of the time. Once we got the hull sanded on the outside, we started to try to figure out how to get to the inside. Ultimately, that involved pulling off the foredeck so that we could sand and repair some of the delamination that was going on around the deck edge. Eventually, we also concluded we'd have to pull out the entire centerboard trunk, which proved to be a monumental job. It had been originally attached with about 24 3-inch long brass screws. Ultimately, also had to disassemble the whole trunk and sand the original centerboard, which was actually a pretty nice piece of mahogany. We also got very good at dremeling out rotten wood and then refilling it with thickened epoxy. The floorboards were all sanded, various other parts sanded and revarnished. The nice part of that being that I could do some of the project in my own garage at home. Time continued to fly by. The parts continued to pile up. But little by little, the hull started to look halfway decent again. Although there was always more sanding. I also knew that eventually I'd have to face how to repair that ugly hole in the bow. But we kept working in the meantime. We also eventually came to face the realization that we'd have to peel the entire bottom off, since the ply was unsalvageable. We were able to use the former plywood pieces as patterns, however. We also found a stencil that suggests the original frame may have came from a kit. Interesting. As far as the hole in the bow, I eventually crafted a Dutchman of sorts, a couple of small pieces of wood to fill most of the hole, and then faired it all in with thickened epoxy. I also recently unearthed perhaps the only piece of live video that I have of this boat. So here it is.
Sean's masterpiece.
Yeah, we got the trailer for $1 too.
Not a bad trailer. Little paint job, and it really looks super duper too.
I was gonna say it would have been easier just to cut out all the pieces from scratch.
You're probably right.
I don't think so.
You got lots of extra pieces here on the side. I bet you'll have extras when you're done.
That's a nice size boat.
Our next task would be to reskin the bottom of the boat. That was easy enough, as far as easy goes. We also planned to fiberglass the exterior of the hull, so we faired in the new chine logs for a nice smooth rounded corner. Those screws were temporary. It was at this point that we started to seal and varnish the interior of the boat and to fair and fill some of the gaps on the exterior boat in preparation for fiberglassing. Some of the gaps were pretty big, but thickened epoxy heals all wounds. Also involved a lot of filling and sanding, trying to get a more or less smooth surface. Finally, we were ready for fiberglass. Again, neither Buddy or I had ever taken on a project quite like this before. We found that if you point at it, it helps expedite the process. The exterior of the hull was glassed, and although it looks kind of rough, it's actually fairly smooth. A couple more coats of epoxy to fill the weave, and then back to the sanders. The sanding, it seems, is never done. Meanwhile, we were also finishing up on varnishing all the small interior parts, reassembling the centerboard case, reinstalling the mast step, reinstalling the mast crutch step, and cutting out new foredecks. But before we could install those new foredecks, we had to paint the interior. And we used, I think, Interlux Brightside paint and put down a nice coat of white on the interior. There were a lot of nooks and crannies. It took quite a while to paint the inside of this boat. But after 2 or 3 coats, she started to look pretty good. Eventually, we got the inside painted and got around to reinstalling the foredecks. That went smoothly enough, and then we proceeded to glass the decks as well. This essentially tied together the entire exterior of the hull. little by little she was coming together. Again, if you point at it, it moves the project right along. Next was an exterior coat of gray primer, just to level things out. And then a very nice royal blue Interlux top coat. She was finally starting to look like a real boat. With the hull painted, I turned my attention toward reinstalling a lot of the small trim pieces, including the floorboards and centerboard cap. Meanwhile, Buddy decided that the trailer needed a complete rebuild. And next thing you know, he had that done as well. At last it was finally coming together. Except for the mast, that is. That still needed a bit of work. But before too long, we had her rigged and ready for her first launch. So there we were, May of 2004, a little over 2 years after we started this project, that we were finally able to launch our boat for the first time. We took her down to San Diego's Mission Bay, dropped her in the water, and off we went. While we dodged jet skiers, we had a great time tacking back and forth. That is, until the rudder broke. Even once the rudder broke, we were able to sail back using only the sails with little trouble. Sadly, I think Buddy and I only got one more opportunity to sail fearless together before he and his family took an opportunity to move back to the New England area. Strangely, it wasn't that long after that my wife and I also moved back to South Carolina, which left Fearless in the custody of my father, who continues to sail her in the Southern California area to this day. And by the way, Fearless, that was the name we eventually gave to this boat. She was named after a Navy minesweeper that I sailed on in the early 80s. It seemed an appropriate name. Fair winds. I hope you enjoyed this video.